Good evening. Welcome to our class, Alpha Ministries, Connecting the Dots. What we're trying to do with this class is to connect the relevant and very important concepts of recovery between AA's 12 steps, as revealed in their big book, and, of course, the Alpha series. One of the things that has crossed my mind here recently about trying to connect these concepts is a little insight I got a couple of weeks ago. I haven't been able to express it very well yet, but the insight was this: that the big book, when you follow through the steps, it guides you into an awareness that God is working for you. In fact, it says repeatedly, we come to realize that God does for us what we can't do for ourselves. He's working for you in your recovery. Now, the big book, obviously, in the 12 steps, emphasizes our responsibility in terms of actually doing the steps, i.e., admitting that we're powerless over our dysfunction and that our lives have become unmanageable because of it, and also coming to believe that a power greater than us could restore us to sanity, and finally, turning our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand Him. Those first three steps all focus on what God is going to do for us, we can't do for ourselves. And then when you go into the housekeeping portion of the 12 steps, steps 4 through 7, you're talking about getting real honest about your character defects, about confessing that those defects to another human being and to God, and then being entirely ready for God to remove those character defects from you and to humbly ask Him to do so. Even in that regard, even in the house cleaning, the one who does the cleaning is God. He does for us, again, what we cannot do for ourselves in removing those character defects. We might recognize they're there, but it's going to require that supernatural power greater than ourselves to remove those character defects from our lives. As we turn the corner relationally and we begin to make a list of the people that we've harmed because of our dysfunction and are willing to make amends with those people, and finally, when we make amends, we're led by the Spirit to do so. There again, it is up to God working in us miraculously to cause us to be willing to make amends and to give us the opportunity to do so without further injury to the folks that we've tried to help. Now, the last three steps of the program really focus, in my mind at least, on a great deal on what God does for us when He tells us that we're going to continue to take a moral inventory every day. Every day we're going to be looking and evaluating ourselves on a daily basis, and when we're wrong. Now, notice it says when we're wrong, not if we're wrong. When we're wrong, we're going to promptly admit it. What does that mean? Well, daily, we've got a battle to fight. We've got a battle to fight from our old conditioning. And as we enter into that battle, we have the strength and the power that comes from that greater power outside ourselves that allows us to continue to fight that battle. Step 11 is probably the one that I want to focus in on the most tonight in connection with what we're going to be studying when we connect these concepts with the Alpha series, and particularly in Romans 8, because step 11 says that we are actually improving our conscious contact with God. Through prayer and meditation, we improve our conscious contact with God, praying only for a knowledge of His will and the power to carry it out. Now, in step 11, we are focusing entirely upon God, entirely upon understanding what His will is for our life in terms of us loving others and in terms of receiving the power to live out this new lifestyle of recovery. And of course, he finishes up with step 12 by saying we've had this spiritual awakening. Now we need to share it with others. We need to give away what we have gotten. So, in a nutshell, the 12 steps focuses primarily on our responsibility in a very practical way to allow God to work for us. The way I want to connect that whole concept of 12 steps of recovery with the Alpha series is to emphasize on this last great provision we studied in Romans chapter 8 last week, and that is the role of the Holy Spirit in our lives, the role of the Spirit of God. I can't think of anything. In fact, I mentioned this for the last couple of weeks in terms of Thanksgiving holiday. I can't think of anything I'm more grateful for, anything I'm more thankful for than the fact that we have the Spirit of God living in us, the one that Jesus called the Comforter. And in Romans chapter 8, Paul presents this as our greatest provision for recovery. It's the marvelous work of the Spirit of God living in that new person God has made us to be that allows us to experience and live out a brand new lifestyle of recovery. And that's what I want us to focus in on tonight. In Romans chapter 8, he tells us, and I'm going to just read a couple of verses to you here just to connect the recovery from a biblical point of view of what God is doing through his Spirit for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. Let me just read it to you. In verse 12, he says, "Therefore, brethren, we are debtors to the flesh, or not to the flesh, rather, to live after the flesh. For if you live after the flesh, you shall die. But if you, through the Spirit, do mortify the deeds of the body, you shall be caused to live." Now, I know that that's kind of a King James mouthful here, so let me try to explain it to you as best I can from a very practical and personal point of view. What he's telling us, in essence, is because we have this tremendous provision, because God has put the Spirit of his Son living inside of the new person we are, because we have this marvelous provision of the Comforter, as Jesus called him, who guides us into all truth, who teaches us, who reminds us, who makes Jesus real to us. Because of this, he says, we're no longer debtors to the flesh. Now, by the flesh, he's talking about our old dysfunctional lifestyle, talking about the way we used to live, talking about all the old coping strategies, all the old habits, and all the character defects with it. We're no longer debtors to that. In other words, we don't have to go on being dysfunctional. Instead, he says, if we, through the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the body, mortify the deeds of the body, that means we, through the Spirit, change, in essence, radically from the old dysfunctional lifestyle to a brand new, functional, healthy lifestyle. We, through the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the body, we shall be caused to live. Now, I know that putting to death the deeds of the body sounds pretty negative, and it's basically, let's put it in an addiction terminology here. We, through the Spirit, say no. You remember back in the 70s when they had this prevention program called Just Say No? And I talked to many addicts and alcoholics about that since. And of course, they all kind of chuckle, like, yeah, right. I'm going to just say no to drugs or just say no to alcohol. Well, that's kind of what this sounds like when he says, we through the Spirit do put to death the deeds of the body. We just say no. But notice something that requires an impossible power that nobody has. Nobody can just say no on their own. That's why he says, we through the Spirit just say no. But even that is still negative. In a moment, I'm going to flip it around and talk a little more about the positive aspect of recovery. But to begin with, we'll keep with the negative aspect here of how are you going to quit? How are you going to quit doing the things that are driving you and other people crazy? How are you going to stop doing that stuff? He emphasizes it right here in this verse, we through the Spirit. As I shared with you in our last study, that means that we have a responsibility and that the Spirit of God has a responsibility. Our responsibility, as I've repeatedly said over and over again in this series, our responsibility comes down to one thing and one thing only, and that is to believe, to trust, to depend on what God says is true. What he says about us is true. What he says he's doing for us is true. To believe that. That's our responsibility. Faith. One word, faith. God's responsibility through his Spirit living in us, one word, power. In other words, we trust God, he gets the job done. He does the changing. He miraculously transforms us. You see, that's what recovery is all about. It's a miraculous transformation process that God does. He does it for us. Now, in order to kind of balance that negative thing from how are we going to say no to how are we going to say yes to living a healthy lifestyle, it's the same principle. Paul told the Galatians, for instance, we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. In other words, we're not doing something to make ourselves okay. We're not engaged in a self-improvement program. You know, I kind of cringe every time I hear the 12 steps of AA categorized as a, quote, self-help program, as if all you have to do is perform certain little rituals as you're going through the 12 steps, and suddenly you'll become clean and sober. It's not a self-help program. It is a miraculous program driven by the power of God, a power greater than ourselves. And so what he's telling us here in these verses is we don't have to go on being dysfunctional. We have the Spirit of God living within us. Now that brings to mind a whole host of questions. I'm not going to have time to deal with them all tonight, but I do want to let you know that I'm aware of those questions and we will be talking about them in the future. And that is the questions about how to be led by, to follow, to hear the Spirit of God in your life. This is a vital, vital concept that is absolutely essential for recovery. It's what makes the difference between recovery just being a self-effort on our part and being a genuine effort on God's part. We've got to learn to listen to the Spirit. And so these verses that follow, Paul is interested in encouraging us along that line. He goes on to tell us, number one, in verse 14, as many as are led by the Spirit are the children of God. If you are a child of God, if you have been born again, if you have turned your will and your life over to the care of God as you understood Him, you are being led by the Spirit. Now, I know you may not know it. I know you may not think about it. I know it may sound foreign to you, but you are constantly being led by the Spirit. Now, I don't have time to get into details again tonight with you. We'll come back to this. But the point I want to leave you with here is that you are continually being led by God's Spirit. Every day, every moment of every day, His Spirit is leading you. But that begs another question. Well, how come I don't hear Him? How come I don't know that I'm being led by the Spirit? One of the big reasons we don't know that we're being led by the Spirit is we don't know He's talking to us. We don't believe He's talking to us. And so what Paul is telling us here is, listen, He's talking and He's talking to you. He's leading you. He's directing you. Pay attention. Try to focus in on that. And again, we're going to give you some more detail on that later. But then he goes on to say, for we have not been given the spirit of bondage again to fear, but the spirit of adoption whereby we cry, Abba, Greek or Hebrew word, Aramaic word for daddy, father. Now, what he's telling us here in verse 15 is this spirit that is inside of you, that is guiding you, directing you, teaching you, leading you. This spirit is not something you need to be afraid of. See, for a long time, I was kind of afraid to hear God. In fact, I was nervous if I thought God was going to talk to me because of what I thought he was going to tell me. I thought he was going to condemn me. I thought he was going to tell me to do something I didn't want to do or to quit doing something I really liked doing. But that's not God. That's the spirit of bondage, again, to fear. You have not received the spirit of bondage, again, to fear, but the spirit of adoption. Now, I didn't really understand what that spirit was until fully understand it until I adopted my daughter, Angela. When I adopted that little kid, she was only 6 months old when we got her into our home. A little tiny thing, was born premature. I didn't want anything out of her. I didn't want to get her to do something for me, to serve me. That wasn't what I wanted as her adopted father. What I wanted more than anything else was to convince that little child how much I loved her, how much I cared for her. That's the spirit of adoption. You see, that's what God wants to convince you of. He wants to convince you of his love for you. And he's put his spirit inside of you to do that very thing. As he goes on in verse 16 to say, his spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are his kids. He loves us. He cares for us. Now, again, we're going to come back and talk about later about the role of the spirit in our life. But I want you to connect that with the overall view of recovery here. The way we're going to recover is through the power, the leadership, the direction of the Spirit living inside of us. And that's a critical concept for us to keep in mind. Tonight, I'm going to bring our panel in. I understand we're short a panel member or two, but maybe they've resolved those issues now. I want to bring them in to talk specifically about this provision that God has made for us concerning the indwelling spirit of his son, Jesus. Well, good. We've got the whole panel. We've got, first of all, this guy that looks like a special operator up there next to the fire. Bill, in case you don't recognize him, that's Bill Lloyd himself. He's outside and enjoying the weather, the cool weather, a little fireside chat. We're glad to have Bill, who is also our host, with us. We've got Tom. Tom made it with us, and David, I see you made it.
Yes, sir.
We had some difficulty getting you hooked up, but glad you're being here. You're here, and also Pam. Pam's back with us too. So, connecting the dots. You know, Pam, I always pick on you every week because I anticipate what God's going to do to connect those dots through you. So I'm not putting you on the spot here, Pam. I'm putting God on the spot here. Tell us what your thoughts are concerning the power of the Spirit in recovery.
Oh, all right. This evening, what you were talking about, what it spoke to my heart from the principles of the big book. First of all, I just have to chime in on the ludicrousy of the concept that the 12-step program is a self-help program. I can't tell you how many doctors I've worked with and such that would say something about, that self-help program you're part of. And I'd like, because how can it be a self-help program if the first step for being in the program is to admit you can't help yourself?
Exactly.
It's like, hello. And so, but what function that does serve, if for me, as soon as I hear somebody say that, I know I'm talking to somebody who knows absolutely nothing about what we're talking about when it comes to a 12-step program. And once I know that, then that gives me some parameters to work within. It's one of my soapboxes. Sorry, I just had to laugh when you mentioned it. When you were talking about what the Spirit's going to be saying to us and being willing to hear the Spirit. And I really appreciate your analogy with adopting Angela and how that matches the experience of the Father. The place that I separate from that is the experience of the child. Um, when usually when we come to this place, whether it's a matter of drug and alcohol recovery or just the recognition that I can't make myself happy, I can't run my own life, this isn't working. When I finally reach that place, I'm not a blank slate anymore. Um, and the power for me of the 12-step program, and I believe it's a big part of what empowers the Spirit of God in to work in our lives, is when I say, I quit. I give up. um you always use the example of, he was going to make you a missionary in Africa or something, and my experience was I had to be at a place where I didn't care. If he wanted me to go to Africa, i won't I won't use my usual example here, I'll restrain myself, but it just has the experience of being at a place where you quit, where you give up. The big book says that we are all looking for an easier, softer way. And while I don't disagree with that in general, specifically, I don't believe anyone ever turns the will and the care, or even makes a decision to turn the will and the care of their life over to God until they reach a place where they are convinced, or at least I love what one of my friends says, you don't have to be convinced of anything, but you got to be seriously suspicious. And you have to be seriously suspicious that anything God is going to ask you to do can't be any worse than what you've been doing. There's no guarantee, at least there wasn't for me, any guarantee that it would be better than what I had been doing. I that's one of the advantages of going to meetings, is it gives you some hope. Step 2 says that I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And I used to love to be argumentative with my sponsor and say, well, yeah, I know he could, but that doesn't mean he would. And so I wasn't convinced that it would be better, but I was convinced it could not be any worse than what I had been doing. And whether you call that hitting bottom, or I tell people all the time, if you have one more rabbit up your sleeve, if you have one more good idea for how you're going to make yourself happy and get this to all work out for you, you're not going to do this. You're not going to do it. And I will say this, it's tacky, but I tell people, if you haven't attempted suicide at least once, you may not be ready for this. Because I believe that suicide attempt is basically a satanic manifestation in our flesh of the spiritual recognition that I'm going to have to die. I'm going to have to die. And that willingness to do that in my soul, spiritually, rather than in my flesh, is a process that took me a long time. But the standard saying is it was the last house on the block. I believe that the Bible version of that story was when all the disciples walked away and Jesus looked at Peter and said, "Are you going to leave me too?" And Peter said something like, "Where would I go?" You have the words of life. I had nowhere else to go. Nowhere to go. And reaching that kind of a place where you're willing to hear God, whether it's a matter of trusting God or not, just a recognition that whatever he had in store for me, what could not possibly be any worse than what I had had in store for myself. I had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose, in my opinion. And when I reached that kind of a place to be willing to hear God tell me whatever he wanted. And of course, like you said, yeah, I had no idea how to hear God. In fact, it was one of the main things that started me seeking was I kept hearing people talk about hearing God. And I'm like, what? How? God had talked to me. And that the book Hearing God that Peter Lord wrote was just pivotal in my life in helping me to understand that. The big book calls that operating on the plane of inspiration. And one of my favorite quotes for that comes from Joyce Meyer, who's my hero. And Joyce says, she was talking to the spirit and said, well, what if I miss you? What if I miss you? And she said she heard the spirit say, Joyce, I know where you are. I can find you. And so moving with that kind of faith that says, I have nothing to lose and he knows where I am, he'll find me. It's just hard on my pride because it's embarrassing to step out and feel like I've heard God and then it doesn't turn out the way I thought it was going to. It's particularly embarrassing if I've drug other people along with me. But what have I got to lose? I have nothing else to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Pam. You do have nothing to lose. You know, one of the things that reminds me of Frank Constantino, passed away and gone to be with the Lord now, had a prison ministry. He visited some fellow on the basement, which is really a bad place for in Rayford prison here in Florida. And he was trying to lead him to the Lord. You know, he was trying to give him some hope and so on. And he went through this whole spiel with him. And he asked if he was ready to pray now, he could turn his will and his life over to the care of God, et cetera, et cetera. And he was astounded. Here this guy was in the basement of Rayford, which you can imagine a dungeon. And it was a dungeon, a true dungeon. And he said, he actually told Frank, he said, I'm not sure I'm willing to give all this up yet. Can you imagine that? I'm not sure I'm willing to give all this up. You know, give all what up? You know, you haven't got anything to give up, man. You're done. But yet that pride in the human heart keeps us locked in sometimes, that very thing. We don't want to hear the spirit because we got a better idea. We'll come talk about that more later on. Let's go to our special operator here. Our special operator, Bill Lloyd, dressed up next to the fireplace here. What do you think about recovery and hearing God and the spirit and all of that sort of thing, Bill?
You know, it hit me when I was listening to you, John. The new life, the new covenant, what God's calling us to, it doesn't work without us hearing from him. Paul talks about, if you look at connecting the dots in Romans 7, he's powerless. He's trying his best, and he says what he hates, he keeps on doing. What the things that he wants to do, he doesn't do, and he's powerless. And he says, "Who will rescue me?" And that's step one. He's saying, I can't do this. Who will rescue me from this body of death? Step two, he's come to believe that God, Jesus Christ, will deliver him. And then step three is getting in, you get into Romans 8, and Paul talks about having the mindset on the Spirit, the personal leadership of the Spirit. And it can't work if you don't hear from God personally leading you. There's no new covenant, there's no newness of life, because the only thing you can revert back to is the law, or read the Bible and try your best to live by the Bible. I had an opposite experience. I assumed that God wanted me to do all those things and to be a good Christian. So I went. As a baby Christian, I went to missionary school, went to Central America for an intense 3-month immersion into missionary work, and I fell flat on my face. And I realized that I was going to tell other people that God loved them to get God to love me. And I came back, and it was a Romans 7. I was stuck, but God is patient, and the spiritual growth of death, resurrection, coming to an end of yourself, dependent on God. It's a process that God leads us, and he lets us fall. We're always falling forward. We're not backsliding. We're falling forward, and God is so patient, and he gets us to a point where, what was it, 35 years later, I'm really trusting that I can hear his voice. When I first listened to the Alpha series, and you taught us, John, to hear from God personally, putting that into practice, there was always this self-doubt. Okay. And I love what Pam said, that God knows where we are. I always trusted somehow that he'd get me back to where I needed to be. So it's a process, and it comes through suffering. It comes through failure. I remember I was going to lead a Christian group at a high school. And high school pushes, you can do it, believe in yourself. And I said, the first step towards the Christian life is you're a failure. I said, that doesn't go over big in our culture, but it's learning that God has us, and he doesn't see us as a failure. It's learning that in our weakness, he is strong. So it's this ongoing process. But the essential part of it is that you do have the Spirit. Christ lives in you. There's things that we just got done studying Galatians chapter 2 in both camps, at the Causeway and out at Freedom Ranch. John's been teaching on it. And John emphasized that this didn't have these things. It was revealed to him by the Spirit. And Paul got a tremendous insight to new covenant, but that God spoke to him personally. And you see where it says that Paul went to the Gentiles. They decided in Acts 15, Paul would go to the Gentiles, the uncircumcised, and that Peter would go to the circumcised group. Notice that the circumcised group, God didn't leave them alone. He sent them ministers. He sent them people to teach them. He didn't write them off because they were screwed up in their thinking. There was nobody more screwed up than I was in my thinking when I first came to know the Lord, and was an extreme codependent, and really thought I had to earn God's love. So I was going to go earn it. If I had to, I was going to earn it. And it was just one miserable failure after another. So it's a process. But the glory of it all is that you can hear from God. He will speak to you personally, and he'll show you things. There's a friend of mine in New Jersey. He has a radio show, Let's Talk About Jesus. God taught him he went on this little retreat by himself, and he had his camera, and he heard in his mind God say to him, hey, do you want a good picture of a deer? Go down this path and up that hill. And he came right upon a deer and got close enough that he had this beautiful shot. Now you would think, well, where's the spiritual growth in that? He didn't, no one got saved, nothing. No, this was God leading him and speaking to him personally. And there's things that you do that you love to do, like, whether it be surfing, swimming, horseback riding, whatever it is, that you might feel guilty for because it's not spiritual, that's God's way to minister to you one time with you. I find that sitting back here by the fire, I couldn't wait for the cool weather to come. So I kind of stare into the fire. And I remember, one time asking God, because you always want to repeat an experience that you had. So one night I was sitting at the fire and God spoke to me clearly and personally. I was so excited. So the next time I went out and sat by the fire and I was waiting. I was like, it's not happening. What happened? Because you always want to repeat things. You make religion. And Jesus kind of spoke to me. I said, enjoy a fire with you. Right? So God speaks to us personally. And if you look at the progression from Romans 7 into Romans 8, it doesn't work unless you can hear from God personally. And you can. That's the thing. So that's the glory of it, that God will speak to us personally. He'll lead us personally. And John, you've been accused of it. We've all been accused of it. That, you're not under law, but under grace. That means you can go do whatever you want. Well, sort of. If you want to hear from God, you want to follow his leadership, go do whatever you want. Believe the gospel, believe the truth. God's going to lead you. He's going to speak to you. And he's going to lead you personally. And it doesn't, and sometimes people might frown on that or look at, oh, God told you that. If you know that you keep walking, and it's a beautiful thing. And his voice is gentle, it's loving, it's kind. It's not, Paul in Romans 8 says that it's not a slavery. Again, notice that he says again, because I think our inheritance from Adam is to run from God, to feel like God's mad at us. So those types of things, that's not the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God, even when the Spirit corrects me, it's always this gentle, loving thing. And I can take it. If Carrie corrects me in the same area, I'll bow up. But when the Spirit speaks to me, it's life, it's revelation, and it's life. So the takeaway is you can, you will, you can, you do, and you have heard the Spirit speak to you personally.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, that's you just brought up a whole bunch of stuff we're going to have to spend some more time on, I can tell already. We're going to be talking a lot about the details of hearing God and following his leadership and facing the consequences of both. So I appreciate what you had to share there, Bill. Let's switch over to David real quick. I'm glad you made it back with us, David. You've had the internet for a while.
Yes, I did.
What do you have to share with us concerning your experience of the personal leadership of the Spirit in your recovery?
All right. Well, thank you. I have to back up and I have to give you my experience. My experience started off coming into a Christian rehab program. Never really darkened the doors of church, or never been involved really with, I had gone to a little bit of AA, but obviously I was a rehab program for drugs and alcohol. And in there, everybody learning about being a Christian, being saved. This stuff was so foreign to me. I mean, I thought I was in the twilight zone, people talking about hearing God, my experience has been a slow process of him revealing himself to me. I was in that program trying to learn how to hear God, because that was the crux of part of the program, was to hear God, was to journal every day, do what they call a DMI, daily moral inventory of ourselves, to try to learn how to hear it. And so that became exciting to me, because, where I was coming from, drugs and alcohol. So the first thing I ever really heard him speak to me was to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. I know that's the first time I recognized his voice speaking to me. that it kind of blew me away. From there, I started learning about the Alpha series. It was brought into this particular program. Started learning about the Alpha series, and that because of, again, where I came from, drugs and alcohol. Prior to that, with no identity, felt lost in this world. Moving into the Alpha series and hearing those truths, this just, I was hearing him again. First it was, his kingdom and his righteousness, and then I started hearing him through the teaching of the Alpha series. So it just enlightened my spirit. And move on, left that program, went out into the world, thought that I had established a relationship with him, and what I had is scratched the surface. And I proceeded to have some relapses and falls, but then he, the Spirit, God, started teaching me his way. It's not my way. In other words, he started teaching me through some of the teachings that John had, some of the teachings of 12 steps, going through step 1, 2, and 3. We're powerless, our lives are unmanageable, come to believe that a power could restore us to sanity, made a decision, and then moving into the character, doing a moral inventory, moving into, asking him to remove our character defects, humbly asking him, moving into making amends. That process of doing that, cleaning some of this, I call it the junk out of the flesh, and then the identity of a new person that he created me to be. That process enabled me to be able to hear him more. This is my experience. But the first thing I started hearing him was in the hierarchy of needs. He made himself apparent to me so clearly, and even does it even to this day, is the need that we have for food, air, water, shelter, a job, to be successful in some form of making an income, and then moving into being worthy. He's just continues and had very strongly, that's the way he spoke to me in first, was that I am worthy, because he constantly, you are worthy because I made you worthy. And because, I have a flesh, my particular flesh is crazy as hell. And so through a process of that, hearing him, and then moving on and starting to hear him make alive some of Romans 6 and Romans 7 and on to Romans 8, he's made that come alive in me, where before it was, when I first studied it, it enlightened me, it touched my spirit, but it didn't take root, if I may. I don't have any other way of saying it. But today, I'm hearing him. I hear him a lot, and I feel like I'm led by him and directed by him. But yet, I still have a flesh that's very sneaky. So it sneaks in there too. So hearing him and being led by him is a daily process for me. As I turn my will and my life over to his care and direction, I ask him to run the show, and I do my best to allow him to teach me. Looking into the mirror, we are changed. That's very powerful for me. I constantly try to do that. In other words, try to stay in his word. So all those things is my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
John,
Yes.
David gave me some heartburn there, I have to say. How David tied in two things. The first thing that he said that he heard from God was actually written in the scriptures too. So he heard, like David knew and was studying the scriptures, and he heard God speak that word to him personally. But the other thing, Dave, when you tied it in with the hierarchy of needs, that for me, that was crucial too, that knowing that I was okay and believing and practicing daily that those needs were met, understanding those needs, it freed me up to hear his voice, because if I did blow it, I was still okay, because Christ did everything. Is because of him I'm loved, accepted, and forgiven, not because of my performance.
Yeah.
So you can turn hearing God's voice into a performance, but if you tie in the hierarchy of needs, knowing that those needs are met in beautiful ways, then that makes it, the fear of failure of not hearing right goes away.
Yeah, exactly, Bill. And, we'll talk about this more as we explore the subject of hearing God a little deeper. I always try to encourage people, when they're trying to learn to hear God, because everybody's, they're nervous about, well, what if I miss him? It's kind of like Pam mentioned, what if I don't hear his voice? Well, God knows where you live. He knows how to talk to you. And like you just said, Bill, I might not have heard it. Am I still okay? Well, I try to encourage people by going just the opposite and say, listen, when you start out trying to hear God, let me give you an ironclad guarantee that you will screw it up. There's no question about it. Your flesh is going to flare up, just like David was talking about. You're going to think you heard God and you didn't. All of that doesn't matter. There's nothing there that really matters, because God is going to override all of that. You are his beloved child. I remember trying to talk to my adopted daughter, Angela, and I had heartburn about trying to talk to her. In fact, I did talk to her. She was only 6 months old. She spoke Korean. Well, she didn't speak anything, but that's all she heard spoken was Korean. And here I was talking to her in English, trying to communicate with her. I didn't quit talking because she couldn't hear me. I kept talking, and you can ask her today. I still talk to her. Okay, so God's not going to give up on you. He's your daddy, man. He knows you can't hear him. He knows you struggle with that, but he's not going to give up on you. He's going to talk to you because he's God and he loves you and he's coming after you. All right, Tom, that little harangue aside here, we'll close it out with you tonight.
Okay, thanks. Dave talked about the flesh being sneaky, and man, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And then for a moment, I couldn't even remember what hit me. And I think that's the enemy attacking. But I remember I talked last week, and I raised the question. It just popped into my head that I wondered how much time had elapsed between Paul writing Romans 6 and Paul writing Romans 7. And I made the comment that if Paul was like me, it was probably, like overnight. In other words, the flesh being so sneaky that even though Paul had a solid handle on Romans 6, that in a blink, the flesh can get you to doubt that and get you totally confused and totally sidetracked and off subject on that. And I think that's just an example. It hit me with the dot that connected for me was that, yeah, the flesh is really, really, really sneaky. Another thing, that Pam had said tonight that struck me, she was talking about, basically that this is not a self-help program we're talking about. And every year some guru comes out with some new self-help book that everybody needs to buy and go out and read and follow, and every year those self-help books, those change and they got to have a new one. And it occurred to me when Pam was talking about that the big book of AA was written, I think approximately, and correct me if I'm wrong, about 90 years ago. And the edition that I have, now is basically the same edition that was circulated probably in the 1930s approximately, and here it is 2020, so it's 90 years ago, and it hasn't changed. And further, the Romans 6, 7, and 8, written by the Apostle Paul, was written over 2,000 years ago. Hasn't changed. So this is clearly not a self-help program, because self-help would bring up another phrase that I hate in recovery, and that is rehab. Rehabilitation. You went to rehab, and you went to a program, a rehab program. Well, rehab, in my mind, means to restore one to its former state. And I think Dave mentioned last week that the former state was the problem that led to the manifestation in the first place. So the former state was the state that we inherited from Adam after the fall. And that is not going to be of any use to us, of any help to us. Because if Adam could have restored the human race after the fall, he would have, but he couldn't. It was not in his ability to do so. So it's not any. If Adam couldn't restore the human race, neither can we restore our own flesh, so to speak. So those are a couple points that I kind of connected in my mind that I thought need to be emphasized. Another thing that I kind of connected is to relapse is to do what I kind of mentioned last week. And here again, here's the drugstore cowboy talking about. Last week I was the drugstore guy telling you that to try to mix law and grace was trying to mix oil and water, and that you can vigorously apply yourself to mixing oil and water, but they don't mix. They don't blend. So to try to mix law and grace is going to cause you to exert a lot of energy, but it's only going to leave you tired and frustrated and defeated. But I'm going to switch hats now because I saw Bill's got Cowboy TV on in the background there. That's what I call a fire. I call it Cowboy TV. And you light a nice fire when it's cold. In fact, I've got one going in the living room, and we're going to go in there and turn off all the lights, and we're going to stare into the fire and let that be inspirational to us. Just Cowboy TV is what I call it. But I want to give you a cowboy analogy here that I've used in my Cowboy Church broadcast, and I think you guys can relate to this. And it relates to regarding verse 14 in Romans 8. It says, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." And when you first read the early part of Romans chapter 8 up to this verse, you might get the false impression that this leadership of the Spirit is something that's up for grabs. And I assure you that that is not the case, that this is not up for grabs, that the leadership of the Spirit is not up for grabs at all. And I look at it kind of like this way. You know, when you're leading a horse on a halter, the horse has a choice to follow you or not follow you. And it's frustrating, and when you're the leader, when the horse doesn't follow you. For example, if you need the horse to go into a horse trailer and the horse won't follow you and they resist and they pull back on the halter, that's frustrated. But it doesn't change the fact that you as a leader need to have that horse go into that horse trailer, because that's what's best for the horse. That's what needs to happen. That's the plan. Likewise, when the horse, you're leading the horse and the horse isn't following you, it's dragging you. In other words, it's charging ahead of you and it's pulling you around as if it knows what the plan is. That's equally frustrating. What is beautiful as the leader, and I think that this is what I think God wants me to do as the follower, is that when you're leading the horse and you can almost have no pressure at all on the lead rope, you can just kind of hold it in your finger, and that horse is just mirroring your every movement and following you without question wherever you want to go, to where the lead rope really isn't even necessary. That's the kind of relationship I think God wants us to have. But I've kind of charged ahead there myself. But the point I'd like to make in recovery is that in my experience, it's not as much as that I'm trying to drag the horse, is that the horse is dragging me ahead. In other words, the horse thinks he knows the plan and he's charging ahead. And that's very much what the mistake I have made many, many times in my recovery, is that I am trying to lead God or charge ahead of God rather than waiting on God. In horsemanship, we call that rating. It's, in other words, it's mirroring, it's following, it's matching the movement and the speed. And my mistake is I often try to charge ahead thinking, and I know what God wants, so I'm trying to beat him there, and that's not following either. It's equally dysfunctional in my mind. But going back to this verse 14, as many as that are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. I kind of look at that as like a mathematical equation. It's not up for grabs. And let's put it this way: 2 + 2 = 4. Correct? I mean, is that up for dispute? Does anybody have any doubt about 2 + 2 = 4? And the answer is no. Well, likewise, you could also say it's just as much a fact that 4 = 2 + 2. Okay? And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. So whether you say 2 + 2 = 4 or 4 = 2 + 2, it's a fact. Well, what Paul's saying here is that as many as that are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. Likewise, the sons of God are led by the Spirit of God. It's not up for grabs. There's no doubt here. So the only thing that's up for doubt is, are we going to drag behind, or are we going to charge ahead, or are we just going to follow the leadership of God? But God, rest assuredly, as much as 2 + = 4 and 4 = 2 + 2, is leading us. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. Finally, one more thing that kind of connected the dots in my mind when, John, you were talking about, Angela, and in verse 16 of chapter 8, it says, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Okay. And it goes on and talks about that adoption, that spirit of adoption, and all of that means, and I won't go into that, but when you adopted Angela, John, I don't think that you consulted her in advance. I don't think you asked her as a 6-month-old, Korean child, whether she wanted to be adopted or not. In other words, you just did it, and that's the way it was, and that's the way it still is and always will be. And it's the same way with God. He's adopted us into his family. That's the way it is, and that's the way it always will be. And that wasn't a bilateral negotiation or a bilateral contract. That was a unilateral contract, is the point I'm trying to make there. And that's the dot that I connected, that, if you'd have left it up to Angela, there's a possibility that maybe she'd have messed it up somewhere along the line. But that's not up for grabs any more than 2 + 2 = 4 or 4 = 2 + 2. So I will rest my case on that.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, the fact that you're bringing up an issue here that is real important, that I want us to explore more fully next week in our broadcast, and that is, we're being led by the Spirit constantly. Well, how come we don't hear it? How come we don't know it? What are the obstacles that keep us from following that leadership, from recognizing that leadership, etc.? So we really need to explore that. It's a lot. Let me just throw out this one word of encouragement. It's a lot easier, more natural than what you might think to begin with. It's not something that there's no ritual associated with it. There's nothing for you to do. There's no choices for you to make in the sense that, you've got to hold your head in a certain way or assume a certain posture or whatever. It's a lot more natural and a lot easier than what we realize. And your point, Tom, emphasizes that you right now are being led by the Spirit right now. So, you can be led by the Spirit going to bed. You can be led by the Spirit going to work. You can be led by the Spirit on vacation. And these are the kinds of issues I really want us to explore next week when we have a little more time to talk about this. So turn it back to Bill, our host tonight, even though he looks like a special operator. You close it out.
Indeed. All right. Well, that was a good discussion. And I like the mathematical idea that we are being led by the Spirit of God. That's awesome. Look at who joined in tonight, piped in. Got Linda, Tammy, Wendy, Sandy.
Yeah.
She put that heart there for you, John.
Where's Sharon from? Where in Ohio are you, Sharon?
Grandma.
Type it in.
Type it in, Sharon. Especially because my daughter Grace, her number one
Oberlin.
school is Oberlin College in Ohio. That's her dream college she wants to go to. Now we just have to dream up the money. Who else? Wendy, Gail, Missy, Sharon. Thanks for joining in, Cindy, and for chiming in. This Thursday night, we're going to be doing the spiritual warfare class. We've been going over the armor of God, the sword of the Spirit, and the helmet of salvation will be this Thursday night at 7 p.m. right here, same Alpha channel. Sunday, 11 a.m., Freedom Ranch is up and running. 9 a.m. at the Causeway, Reach Community Church. Both places are studying the book of Galatians without communicating with each other. Bob Jernigan decided on that, and John decided on it at the same time, but they didn't talk to each other, so that was pretty cool. And any other announcements? Pam, you got anything coming up? How's that? Oh, we got to unmute you. How's that Recovery Church coming along?
It is going. It is going. Yes, meeting at the Crossings on Saturday at 4. Doing just in so many words exactly what we're doing here. So that's a real exciting
Awesome. And
development.
Tom's got
Thank
Cowboy
you.
Church Sunday morning, right? What time?
Yeah,
is it?
and we're going into Galatians there, and all the work we did in Genesis regarding Abraham and grace and Abraham, grace in the Old Testament regarding Abraham, was all so that we could go into Galatians and Romans, and John even mentioned that no one at church that no one ever preaches on circumcision. Well, I beg to differ, sir. If you go back and look at my message earlier that day, I preached on circumcision.
That's because you're weird like us, Tom.
Probably. Yeah.
All right. So that's all the announcements. So stay in fellowship and listen to the still small voice. Follow the leadership of the Spirit, and know that you know that you know that you know that you have it. That the Spirit's leading you. And good night, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you either Thursday night or we'll see you in person at one of the locations out at Freedom Ranch. And have a good night. Stay warm.